King County Executive down Constantine, Senator Steve Hobbs, and Seattle Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all for joining this conversation. As you all know, and the audience doesn't, but as we were trying to figure out how to put this together, we started our day with kind of a political economy conversation. We had a lunchtime conversation around the Republican Party, and this is meant to be a conversation around progressivism and the Democratic Party, and it sort of morphed into a little more of a focus on governance, and then we had state, county, city participation. So I really am appreciative not only of you being here, but of each of your level of patience in dealing and working with me and us. Senator, let me ask you first. Let me just start with you. And what does it feel like? I mean, congratulations on retaining the majority. What does it feel like being the 25th vote in a lot of these conversations? And I ask because you're well regarded as a centrist in many instances, but knowing you're also actually sort of spiritually so fully a progressive. You're so fully a Democrat. You've never sort of wavered there, but you don't always get a lot of credit for being on the left because you're not always left enough. How do you sort of feel like progressive? What is it like to be to talk about progressivism in Olympia, where the range of progressive is quite wide?
Yes, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to be here. I was a little shocked that I was in the progressive panel, so any progressives out there, you represent any of those groups, please take a Facebook shot of me and let people know that I'm on this panel. So
Hashtag
I am a progressive. It is difficult being a moderate in a district that's, I've got some rural parts, and I do have some small urban parts to it, so it is difficult. But my vision of progressive really is equality for all and opportunity. And also it's understanding that not all Democrats are the same. Those that live on Queen Anne are different type of Democrats than myself. I can't go as far as they can, and I wouldn't want to. So I'm hoping going into this session that my colleagues on the left understand that. Because I've been in majorities before. And unfortunately, in those situations, if I go back, I was looked at, and moderates were looked at as the enemy, the stoppers of progressive policies. But that's not the case. I think for me, it's about being incremental in progressive policies, much like we do with marriage equality. Because the people in my district, my constituency, can't go as far as those in Seattle. And so I'm glad that we're in the majority, but I'm a little leery what might happen to me during this next session.
Let me ask you real quickly, Senator. Somebody said to me today, the Democratic caucus in the Senate is only as progressive as Steve Hobbs.
Oh, boy.
Is that fair?
No. I don't want to be the target. I think we have a lot of great things that we're going to be pushing for. Reproductive parity, Voting Rights Act. I think there's a lot of things that as a caucus that we agree on, but how we get there may be different. Yeah. And I think that those on the left have to look at the end state, not what's, what interest group is going to like this or not. Yeah. So,
Mr. Executive, you've been, of course, a legislator, a policymaker, and it's different, I think, probably being an administrator and an executive. How do you sort of navigate this? How do you put progressive vision into governing action in a time when, again, party orthodoxy is pretty strict right now, and governing is often about, navigating the gray of detail?
Well, thank you for having us. I appreciate it. And Senator Hobbs is right, and I hope we talk about this a little bit more. Being progressive is about a set of shared values, and I think the values that we call progressive actually are the values of the vast majority of America. The way in which those values get served through electoral politics and public policy sometimes get narrowed to sort of cartoonish or stereotyped positions on issues, and we get ourselves into a box. And you can see the Republicans do that in Congress all the time. Things become litmus tests, and I'm not talking about fundamental issues like the ability of every person to succeed in life, or respect for your individual privacy and rights, or the obligation to leave the earth better than we found it. I'm talking about the minutia of legislation and the alphabet soup of code that we become wedded to. And we have to continually remember to focus on progressive outcomes we want, on making sure we're advancing the cause of human liberty and opportunity through our actions. And sometimes that means that we're going to have to adapt and adopt our positions on issues. In King County, well, first of all, statewide, I mean, every elected Democrat, with maybe the exception of one, who is not present on today's panel, is part of the resistance, right? There are elected Democrats from moderate and conservative areas that are elected Democrats from the most liberal bastions in Seattle, all of them standing up to what is happening nationally. And the takeover of our national government has forced us all into this reactive position, but it is also bringing us together around this set of shared values and love for our country. In King County, we've been able to really make that resistance real in a number of ways. We joined with the city of Seattle in setting aside $2.25 million to help immigrants and refugees with civil legal assistance and with the ability to know their rights so they can defend themselves against the federal government. In public health in King County, we made our clinics places that are designated as private areas so that if a federal agent wants to come and try to detain a mom who's brought her sick kid in for help, they're going to have to get a warrant to do that. They can't simply barge in and detain that family. In policing, we have clarified and reiterated that police officers are not to ask for your papers before they render assistance to you. We want you to be able to be part of the community that is creating genuine safety, and that means being able to report crimes, being able to testify in court, not being driven into the shadows. And just in closing on this question, you know, we've worked with other jurisdictions on similar efforts. There's one good example is on the Affordable Care Act. So the Republican Congress tried and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed to repeal the ACA. But this government, federal government, has been withdrawing the funds required to market and sign people up. And so we have stepped up, along with our partners, to invest in navigators, to help people enroll, to open new enrollment centers, to fill in the gaps that are being very intentionally created to help people be able to have that support in their lives. And, you know, we can't do these, we can't fill in all of the gaps that are being created. Mm-hmm. We can't make up for the loss of money for healthcare and the loss of money for transit and the loss of all of these things that the Republicans are attacking. But we will do our darndest to make sure that we are serving those fundamental beliefs that every person should have the opportunity to succeed and not be held back by the situation into which they were born.
Let me ask you just sort of a direct question about Republicans, I guess. Do you see the national congressional Republicans in the same way that you see the Republicans on the county council, or do you differentiate between a Northwest Republican and a Washington, D.C. Republican?
Remember, like, Obama won every single King County Council district. So although there are 3 Republicans on our nonpartisan council, the fact is that they have a very different constituency. And it's kind of like what you were talking about with your constituents, right? They cannot take the extreme positions that congressional Republicans are taking in their red states. Mm-hmm. And they personally, I know, do not agree with a lot of what Mr. Trump does and says. And so, yeah, it's a different situation, and it is to an extent a different situation in the state legislature as well. You know, the legislature occasionally veers toward the models set on the national stage, but the fact is they're still closer to the people, and they still, I think, feel that pull of the original motivation they had running for office, which was to serve these shared values that most Americans share.
Councilmember, congratulations on your win.
Thank you very much.
I came to learn during your election that you're an arch conservative.
That what?
That you're an arch conservative. Anybody who knew you knew of your advocacy in Olympia knew of you as a progressive voice in Olympia. Somehow, as a woman, as a Latina, as as an executive at the Washington State Labor Council, director of government affairs, then campaigns and policy, somehow you got positioned to the right of your opponent in Seattle. How does that happen?
Well, I think it's a really good question. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about what you're doing with The Wire.
Thank you.
Excited to be here and be part of this incredible lineup. I think that it is very telling in a year where we saw record numbers of women, record numbers of people of color, record numbers of the LGBTQ community stand up and run for office. We won, and I am one of them. And at the same time, both the Seattle Times and The Stranger said that I was too establishment and didn't endorse me. And so my response was, if a 37-year-old Latina woman from the labor movement, never run before, didn't grow up rich, never thought of running, is now establishment, we've come a long way, Seattle. Thank you. And we got 60% of the vote on election night, and we won by about 5 or 6 points in a primary that was an 8-way race, and I'm really proud of that. And I think, to your point about what it means to be progressive, forget about the Times, forget about The Stranger, forget about the titles and the labels that were put on me. We had workers, union members, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, women's health groups, senior advocates, kiddo advocates, environmentalists, people standing up and saying, please run, and then when I ran, endorsing me because we want to have good governance. We want to have people who are going to stand by each other and work together, especially in these tough times. From the local level in Seattle, in King County, and at the state level, I think in our corner of the state we can show once again what it means to have good governance. And that's part of the reason that I think we won. I also think that part of the reason that you see Democrats winning right now, hopefully we'll continue to win this afternoon. I haven't checked in the South yet, but it's because we are now standing up and saying, we're going to show you what we stand for, not what we stand against only. And what we stand for is what some of the things you heard about. Voting Rights Act, reproductive justice, making sure people have access to equal pay, fighting for health care for everyone, standing up for the rights of workers and standing proud for collective bargaining and unionization, standing up to protect retirement security and making sure everybody has child care. These are things that we stand for, and Elizabeth Warren was out here a few months ago and she said, we have got to tell people what we stand for, and I think this panel and this program that you've put together today, if we want to talk about the future of the progressive movement, we have to talk about what we stand for and be willing to work with everyone, because we got bigger issues at play here. We are not going to get money from the federal government, let alone money. They're coming after us, our community, workers, women, the LGBTQ community. So we have got to figure out new and innovative ways of working together, and I think the executive said it well. Not be reactionary, not be purist in who we're going to work with, and think about how we cross lines and work together. I think because of that message that I said in the campaign, because I said I want to work with folks and actually have good governance, because I said idealism does not have to be in opposition to pragmatism, and we can actually come up with good policies and push the ball forward and fight for justice, that's why I think there was a false narrative out there, a false label put on me as being establishment. But let's be real. We know how to get policy done. This working together thing, being collaborative, that's not a bad word. That's how we got health coverage for all kids, right? I know Senator Hobbs was involved in that. We got Affordable Care Act implemented in our state, and because of the executive's leadership in King County, had the highest numbers of rates of insured folks in our state's history, and King County was among the highest in our state. And we did this by working together and not writing people off. So if there's one thing I'm going to be fighting for, it is to break down those labels, break down those barriers, and especially in a time like now, in a state like Washington, in a county like King County, and in a city like Seattle, we've got to find the intersectionalities of our struggles, figure out how we're going to work together with very limited resources, with the feds coming after us, and really fight for our progressive values. And I think that's what it means to be a progressive now under Trump, and to push the ball forward.
Governor Inslee's Chief of Staff. David Postman was on a podcast with us and said that, Seattle politics, that represents the range of political opinion from A to B. And in Olympia, it's the whole alphabet. And how will you take some of that orthodoxy that exists in the progressive movement in Seattle, convene it, get it to work together, and bridge to the state where policymakers still have tremendous influence over cities, they still have tremendous influence over funding? How do you, what are your thoughts on how you can bring some of the forces that elect a Shama Sawant and make them constructive voices with people who elect Senator Steve Hobbs? They have different political views, Councilmember Sawant and Senator Hobbs.
So I'm looking at this really from my own lived experience, my perspective as a woman, as a person of color, as a younger person, mid-30s, also as a renter, wanting to own one day in the city of Seattle. Everything that I think is on our plate right now relates to affordability in the city and the ability to create greater economic stability. And if you think about all of the issues that allow for an individual or a family to have economic stability, it's building enough affordable housing, both for renters and for people who want to own and stay in Seattle. It's affordable childcare. It's hopefully a regional health plan that I hope to work with the executive and King County council members on. It's actually creating economic opportunities through education and training programs, apprenticeship opportunities, free college tuition like the mayor has called for. These are things that create greater economic stability, and also we cannot do these alone. These issues are, I think, must be dealt with in conjunction with the state and the county. And if you think about, for example, the issue of homelessness, which is plaguing our city, as the executive and the mayor said in a press conference just last week, I think, oh my God, I've only been in office for 2 weeks. It's all gone by very fast. Homelessness, mental health issues, the lack of affordable housing, these are issues far bigger than our borders, but far too big to ignore or to wait for somebody else to come in and fix. The state legislature, I'm so glad you guys now have progressive majorities, but we can't wait for you to hopefully pass the capital budget. I know you're going to do it this year, but we can't wait. We can't wait for the feds to step in with additional resources, so we got to come together and work across party lines, traditional party lines, and also not put people in camps like we used to do. I think that's how we create progress. And also to see that this isn't, we can't silo these issues, because if we don't have enough affordable housing in Seattle, folks are going to continue to move south and north. And this is a regional issue, it's a statewide issue, and we all got to have everybody at the table to find solutions.
Senator, let me ask you, you just had a statewide race where you got to experience the joy of a primary. Those are always more personal, as both of you know, all three of you know, always more personal than running against a member of the other party. I'm reflecting on Nick Hanauer this morning, who was highlighting the fact that he thinks our economy is generating just a lot of angst, anger, and that is manifest through more volatile elections, more volatile economic activity, and demonstrations on the street. Do you see some of that anger manifesting in Democratic voters in a way that is, again, driving this orthodoxy? Is there a disconnect between what it takes to govern and what people are calling for in the Democratic progressive movement in terms of vision and demands from their elected officials?
Yes, I do. I think that you have this fight. I think, as a Democrat, I'll take an example, minimum wage increase. I wanted a minimum wage increase. Several moderate Democrats wanted a minimum wage increase. We had a different way of going about it. We wanted preemption, so it would blanket the state. It was going to be higher than more than anything in the country, yet the left attacked myself and Mark Mullen. In fact, went to the point where they handed out these unhappy meals It looked like McDonald's bag with a hamburger in it. I still have it in my office. You know, Ronald McDonald's sad, and he's asking you, why is Steve Hobbs against this? That is what I'm afraid of going into this session. Here I am, a moderate Democrat, a centrist in a swing district where if I lose, Democrats do not hold the majority in the state Senate. And here I am advocating for an increase in the minimum wage. The only real difference is preemption, yet I'm being attacked because I wasn't pure. Like I didn't follow everything that they wanted. And that's what concerns me, because I've seen this before. Now, of course, I'm told by others, don't worry about that. We've learned our lessons, but we'll see what happens. I'm prepared.
Yeah. Mr. Executive, let me ask you, not that you've ever thought about running for higher office, but if you had maybe thought about running for higher office, the politics of progressivism at the statewide level are different than in King County or the city. You've obviously worked at the state level as a representative and then senator. How do you sort of foresee the future of progressive politics being informed by governance? In other words, we all think that one can make a case for the good work that one does while in office, but are the ambitions of the progressive electorate, do they far exceed what any members are able to do in office? Or do we still have a real clear line?
I mean, there are obviously, especially around election times, a lot of true believers who will be disappointed by anything that doesn't utterly fulfill their dreams of the change that could happen in their community. But for those of us who are charged with really governing, we recognize that you get the best that you can and then build on that foundation. And this is kind of goes to the thing you were talking about with incrementalism, Steve. The challenge is ascertaining what the most progress is that you can make in a particular political environment and then healing in that progress. So my charge to my staff at King County has been to live these progressive values through our governing. And first and foremost, and the thing we started with, was really making sure we're getting the most value for the public's dollar and delivering the most services. Building a culture of continuous improvement and becoming what somehow came to be known in our universe as the best run government. We're competing to see if we can be better than anyone at doing those things, delivering services, because delivering the infrastructure, delivering the services that allow people to live successful lives is a progressive value. That is a progressive agenda. Second, we constructed I think, nationally recognized equity and social justice plan and are working to make sure that everything we do internally and externally has the benefit of that ESG lens, that looking at our decisions about budget and policy in the context of what's this going to mean for folks who've been held back in life by their circumstances, against whom the deck has been stacked. And making sure that we are not exacerbating those challenges, but rather diminishing them so that, as I said, the progressive value, every person can have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. There comes a time when you need to use your political capital, though, to really turn the dial, move the needle, create real change. So a couple of years ago, I started a measure that we put to the voters and was adopted called Best Starts for Kids. And this is our attempt to begin turning the tide on this trend in America to simply neglect, and then react to bad outcomes, and to invest early, and in this case, so that kids can get off to the best start in life. And I wanted to let King County voters and taxpayers know that today we were able to announce, after the first year, our first Best Starts program has kept 3,000 people, 1,000 families housed who otherwise were in grave danger of falling into homelessness, and gotten them back on their feet and on the road to self-sufficiency.
Great. Councilmember, let me ask you about the role of media in defining what is or is not progressive. In the city of Seattle, the stranger is a dynamic force. Seattle Times is obviously an important voice. We're in an era of fake news and everyone has a megaphone. What is the role, as you see it, of media in defining what is or is not progressive in Seattle?
Well, first, let me just make a few comments about some of the other comments that were made, because I probably had worked with some of those folks dropping off those unhappy meals and know what it's like to be on the other side trying to make sure that we're holding folks accountable, and I want to make sure that I'm holding myself accountable to those same standards. I think as we go forward and think about the opportunity that's presented itself with, again, progressive majorities in the House and the Senate, progressives in King County and Seattle and across our state, we truly do have an opportunity to show what we stand for. And I think to make sure that we're advancing the ball every single time we can, because what I worry about is at the end of election or at the end of the first quarter in Seattle City Council, are people going to say, we elected them and they didn't do anything, or session happened and nothing happened. And I don't want it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that people think government failed, because there is a narrative out there, Fox Media puts it out, other news outlets put it out, that government doesn't do their job. And if it's self-fulfilling, the end goal is privatization. And so I think we have to show what we stand for, advance the ball as much as possible, push for those progressive values, and lift up workers, women, the most vulnerable, to show people that when we get elected, we do make change. And I also think it's important to show, especially now, what we won't stand for. And what we won't stand for is sexual harassment, assault, and intimidation. And especially when we get more women and people of color and the LGBTQ community and strong progressive allies like the executive into these seats, we can push forward agendas that say not only are we going to call out individuals, we're going to change cultures so that there's a zero tolerance policy. And I think right now, our country, our communities are hungry for action. They are hungry for people to respond to the Me Too movement. They're hungry for people to hear the women who have the Believe Women stories, and they're hungry for change in culture and policy. So I know that that's one action that we can, as a collective, as progressives, take on this year to show the electorate that we are listening, and we are not only in listen mode, we are in action mode, and we will change policy and culture. And to that point, the media on this issue of Me Too and Believe Women, we're setting the narrative, right? If you see the conversation that's happening around women being in the front of this conversation, it's not just about individual behavior that we're calling out. We're talking about cultural norms and how we can change policy. And the fact that I and so many other women stood up to run for office is because we want to not only ask for policy change, but be there to make those policy changes. And so we don't have to rely per se on the media to tell the story for us. When we can tell the media, when we can tell the stories, especially with social media at our hands, not be afraid to talk to our partners who are reporters, talk about our stories, know that those stories will get shared, know that we'll be listened to. This is how we stand up and change the narrative. And I think that it also shows there's less reliance on editorial endorsements, perhaps. I think that maybe I would have been won by more had I won one of those two newspapers. But I think that people are making their own decisions by looking at who they trust, by looking at who has endorsed them, and by looking at actual achievements and leadership style. And I think people want somebody who's going to work with others and know how to do that. So I look for action, I look for collaboration, and I look for us to tell our own stories.
You can see we got a minute and a half left. I want to ask each of you 2 quick questions. So that means you give me 1 or 2 words. Can we do that? We'll see. Councilmember, we'll start with you. This is a question for all of you. Is there any chance in 2020, is there any chance in 2020 that the Democratic Party will nominate a straight white man for president? If there is a not straight white man running, is there any chance that in this Me Too movement of multicultural Big Tent Democratic Party that there will be a straight white man? elected?
Is your question how excited will we be to have fill in the blank, Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren? I think there's definitely a chance. We need progressives who are going to win.
Okay.
But I
Oh, we
think,
only got a minute.
I think the community
Executive?
wants to see
Yes.
women people.
You think there's a chance?
There's a chance, but more historically, there's a chance we won't nominate a straight white man and we'll nominate someone who represents the future.
Just be Donald Trump. Just be Donald Trump.
Like McNeil Lehrer, I'm like, no, there's no chance. There's no chance. My mic dead now? Maybe it's smartly. I feel like the McNeil Lehrer hour, and I was like, no, there's no chance we'll nominate one for president. That's just me. Senator, last word to each of you. What does it mean to be a Hobbs, Steve Hobbs progressive?
Oh boy.
One word or 2 words?
2 words. Dangerous.
What does it mean to be a Dow Constantine progressive?
Focus on outcomes.
Teresa Mosqueda
What
progressive.
does it mean? Fierce.
Fierce. Awesome. Let's give him a round of applause.
That was good.